What if I told you that 15 men climbed into obsolete torpedo bombers on the morning of June 4, 1942, knowing they were flying toward almost certain death, that they watched their squadron commander deliberately break formation and lead them away from their fighter escort, away from safety, toward the heart of the Japanese carrier fleet? And that every single one of them followed him anyway, not because they believed they would survive, but because they understood something deeper about duty, sacrifice, and what it means to make a choice when no good choices remain. This is the story of Torpedo Squadron 8 at the Battle of Midway. It's about Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, a part-Sioux cowboy from South Dakota, who trusted his instincts over his orders. It's about 29 young men, most barely out of their teens, who pressed home an attack against overwhelming odds. And it's about Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor, who spent 30 hours floating in the Pacific Ocean, hiding under a seat cushion, while the greatest naval battle of the war raged around him. This story challenges everything we think we know about heroism. Because these men didn't succeed in the traditional sense. They scored no hits. They sank no ships. All 15 of their aircraft were shot down. Yet their sacrifice changed the course of World War II in ways that still echo through military history today. By May 1942, 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy was fighting for its survival in the Pacific. The Japanese had swept through Southeast Asia with terrifying efficiency. Wake Island, Guam, the Philippines, all fallen. Singapore, impregnable Singapore, had surrendered. And in early May, at the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Americans had fought the Japanese to a tactical draw, but at terrible cost. The aircraft carrier USS Lexington lay at the bottom of the Coral Sea. The Yorktown had limped back to Pearl Harbor with a bomb crater in her flight deck. And the Japanese, despite losing the light carrier Shoho, still possessed 4 fleet carriers of the Kido Butai, the carrier striking force that had devastated Pearl Harbor. These weren't just ships. They were floating airfields crewed by the most experienced naval aviators in the world. Men who had been fighting in China since 1937. Against this force, the United States Navy could muster 3 carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, both relatively new but untested in major fleet action, and Yorktown, which should have required months of repairs but was being patched together in just 72 hours by round-the-clock work crews at Pearl Harbor. It wasn't enough. Everyone knew it wasn't enough. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Aboard the USS Hornet, Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8, was preparing for combat they hoped would never come. The squadron had been commissioned in September 1941 under the command of Lieutenant Commander John Charles Waldron. At 41 years old, Waldron was ancient by aviator standards. His men called him Skipper with a mix of respect and affection. His superiors called him difficult, argumentative, a troublemaker who questioned orders and thought he knew better than everyone else. They were right. He did. John Waldron had grown up on the South Dakota frontier, the great-great-great-great-grandson of colonial settlers and the descendant of Oglala Lakota on his mother's side. He'd worked as a ranch hand, knew how to break horses, could box and wrestle with the best of them. When his classmates at the Naval Academy called him a sea-going cowpuncher, it wasn't an insult. It was recognition of something elemental in his character. Waldron didn't do things by halves. He'd graduated in 1924, become a naval aviator in 1927, and spent the next 14 years becoming one of the Navy's most experienced torpedo bomber pilots. By 1941, when he took command of VT-8, Waldron had forgotten more about aerial torpedo tactics than most pilots would ever learn. His squadron reflected his intensity. Most of the pilots were ensigns, fresh from flight school, kids in their early 20s. Ensign George Gay from Waco, Texas. Ensign William Evans from California. Ensign Grant Teets from Kansas. Ensign Jeff Woodson from Arkansas. 15 pilots total, each with a radio man gunner in the back seat. 30 men. Waldron trained them hard, harder than other squadron commanders thought necessary. He drilled them on navigation, on torpedo approaches, on what to do when, not if, they faced enemy fighters without escort. He gave them lectures on Japanese tactics, on zero capabilities, on what it felt like to have tracers coming at you and knowing you couldn't speed up, couldn't turn away, couldn't do anything except hold your course and pray your torpedo would release before you died. If there is only one plane left to make the final run, he told them before Midway, I want that man to go in and get a hit. They understood what he was saying, that he expected casualties, that he expected most of them wouldn't come back, that the mission mattered more than their lives. Nobody questioned it. This was 1942. This was 6 months after Pearl Harbor. The idea that America might lose this war was very, very real. The squadron's aircraft were Douglas TBD Devastators, and by May 1942 they were already obsolete. Designed in 1934, first flown in 1935, entering service in 1937, the Devastator had been revolutionary. First all-metal monoplane in U.S. Navy carrier service, first aircraft with hydraulically folding wings, first with an enclosed cockpit for all 3 crew members. By the time of Midway, it was a death trap. Maximum speed, 206 miles per hour, less than 210 in a shallow dive, cruise speed barely over 100. The Japanese A-6M0 fighter could do 330 miles per hour. Do the math. The torpedo itself was even worse. The Mark XIII aerial torpedo, the weapon the entire Devastator was designed to carry, was notoriously unreliable. It required a drop from no more than 50 to 100 feet altitude, at speeds not exceeding 115 miles per hour, on a straight and level approach. Read that again. 50 feet. 100 to 15 miles per hour. Straight and level. If you're attacking a carrier defended by fighters and anti-aircraft guns, those parameters are a suicide prescription. You have to fly low and slow in a perfectly straight line toward a target that's shooting at you with everything it has, while enemy fighters dive on you from above, and you cannot evade, cannot maneuver, cannot do anything except bore in straight and true and hope you live long enough to drop your torpedo. And even if you do, the torpedo probably won't work. At Midway, of 41 torpedoes dropped by American TBDs, exactly 0 hit their targets. Some ran too deep. Some ran in circles. Some exploded prematurely. Some didn't arm at all. The ones that did hit frequently failed to explode. Waldron knew all this. His pilots knew all this. They flew the Devastators anyway because those were the aircraft they had, and there was a war to fight. In March 1942, the Navy had started delivering the TBF Avenger, the Devastator's replacement. 21 brand new Avengers were allocated to VT-8, but they arrived too late. Hornet was already preparing to embark Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle's B-25 bombers for the raid on Tokyo. There was no time to train the entire squadron on the new aircraft. Waldron made a decision. He split his squadron. The more experienced pilots, himself included, would stay with Hornet and the Devastators. Lieutenant Harold Swede Larson would take the junior ensigns and remain behind with the Avengers, complete the training, and join them later. It seemed sensible. The experienced pilots got the obsolete aircraft. The rookies got more training time and better planes. Waldron took 15 of his 30 pilots to war. The other 15, including Larson, stayed behind. Neither group knew that 6 of those Avengers and their crews would end up at Midway Island, not on a carrier. Neither group knew that those 6 Avengers would attack the Japanese fleet that morning and 5 would be shot down, with only 1 crew surviving. VT-8 would lose more men at Midway than any other squadron in the battle, not because they were poorly trained or poorly led, but because they were ordered to do the impossible, and they did it anyway. By early June, American codebreakers had achieved something remarkable. They'd penetrated enough of the Japanese naval code to determine not just that an attack was coming, but where and approximately when. Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii, was the target. The Japanese planned to invade and occupy it, drawing the American carriers into a decisive battle that would destroy them. Admiral Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, was sailing with 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the same 4 that had struck Pearl Harbor. He had 2 light carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 12 destroyers. And he had every reason to believe he would win. Admiral Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, knew the Japanese were coming, but knowing didn't mean he could stop them. He had 3 carriers to their 6. His pilots were less experienced. Many of his aircraft were obsolete, and the Japanese had never lost a carrier battle. The morning of June 4, 1942, dawned clear and bright over the central Pacific. Search planes from Midway had located the Japanese fleet at 0520, 170 miles west of the atoll. Every available aircraft on Midway launched to attack. B-17 bombers, B-26 Marauders, rigged with torpedoes, Marine dive bombers, Marine fighters. They accomplished nothing. The Japanese fleet shredded them. Zeros shot down fighters and bombers with contemptuous ease. Anti-aircraft fire destroyed those the fighters missed, and not a single hit was scored on any Japanese ship. Aboard Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown, American carrier crews began launching their strikes. The plan was simple in theory. Coordinate an attack with dive bombers from high altitude, torpedo bombers from sea level, and fighters providing escort. Hit the Japanese carriers simultaneously from multiple directions. Overwhelm their defenses. In practice, nothing went according to plan. Hornet launched first, starting around 0700. 15 TBD Devastators of VT-8 under Lieutenant Commander Waldron, 35 dive bombers, 10 fighters. The plan was to fly together as a coordinated strike group, the fighters high with the dive bombers, everyone arriving at the target simultaneously. Commander Stanhope Ring, Hornet's Air Group commander, led the formation southwest on a heading he calculated would intercept the Japanese carriers. Waldron disagreed. He believed the Japanese would turn north after completing their strike on Midway. He'd been studying Japanese tactics for months. He'd wargamed every possible scenario. He knew, with the absolute certainty that comes from deep professional expertise, that Ring's course was wrong. He'd argued about it the night before. Ring had dismissed him. Captain Mitcher, Hornet's commanding officer, had backed Ring. Orders were orders. Waldron would follow Ring's course. But as the formation headed southwest, Waldron's instincts screamed at him that they were going the wrong way. The Japanese carriers weren't there. Every mile they flew southwest was a mile away from the enemy. At around 0800, Waldron made his decision. He broke formation. Without fighter escort, without dive bomber support, without permission. He turned VT-8 northwest, toward where his gut told him the enemy would be. The rest of Hornet's air group continued southwest under Ring's command. The fighters stayed high with the dive bombers. As ordered, they would find nothing but empty ocean. By the time they realized their mistake and turned back, they'd be critically low on fuel. Some would ditch in the ocean, others would barely make it back to the carrier. But Waldron wasn't thinking about them anymore. He was thinking about the 30 men in 15 Devastators following him into the unknown, trusting his judgment over official orders, knowing that without fighter cover they were flying into a meat grinder. He tried to radio Ring, tried to get the fighters redirected to protect his torpedo bombers. "Stanhope from Johnny 1, he called repeatedly. "Stanhope from Johnny 1. The radios crackled with static. No response came. The fighters were too far away now, receding into the distance with the dive bombers. VT-8 was alone. Ensign George Gay was flying the number 1 position, directly behind and to the left of Waldron. He could see his skipper's head through the greenhouse canopy of the TBD ahead, could see him scanning the horizon, searching. Behind Gay flew the other 13 aircraft, strung out in a loose formation, each one carrying a pilot and a radioman gunner, each one carrying a 2,000-pound Mark XIII torpedo that probably wouldn't work even if they survived long enough to drop it. Gay had joined VT-8, fresh from flight school, a 25-year-old kid from Texas who'd wanted to fly for as long as he could remember. He'd tried to join the Army Air Corps first, been rejected for medical reasons. The Navy took him. He earned his wings in September 1941, 3 months before Pearl Harbor, got his commission as an ensign on October 14th. By June 4th, 1942, he had exactly 0 combat experience. He'd never dropped a live torpedo, never been shot at, never seen a man die. In about 30 minutes, he would experience all of these things simultaneously. At 09:20, Waldron spotted the Japanese fleet. His instincts had been perfect. There, on the horizon, were the 4 Japanese carriers, exactly where he'd predicted they would be. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the most powerful concentration of naval air power in the world, surrounded by a screen of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Waldron radioed the position back to Hornet. Stanhope from Johnny 1. Enemy carriers sighted. He gave the coordinates. Then he added, proceeding to attack. There was no discussion, no waiting for the fighters or dive bombers, no hesitation. Waldron had found the enemy. Now he would attack them. With 15 obsolete torpedo bombers, no fighter escort, no dive bombers to split the enemy's attention. Nothing but 30 men and 15 aircraft that couldn't outrun, couldn't outclimb, couldn't outfight the defenses they were about to face. The Japanese spotted them immediately. Combat Air Patrol, Zeros, having just finished shredding the Marine fighters from Midway, were still at altitude with fuel and ammunition to spare. They came screaming down out of the sun. Waldron pushed his throttle forward, diving toward the wave tops. The Devastators followed. Their only hope, slim as it was to get down low where the Zeros would have less room to maneuver, where the anti-aircraft gunners on the carriers would have to aim carefully to avoid hitting their own fighters. Gay watched as the first Zero latched onto Waldron's tail, machine gun bullets stitched across the water, tracking toward the lead Devastator. Tracers arced through the sky, beautiful and deadly. Waldron's rear gunner, Chief Radioman Horace Dobbs, returned fire with his single 30-caliber machine gun, the only defensive armament the aircraft possessed. It wasn't enough. Nothing was enough. More Zeros arrived. 5, 10, 15 Japanese fighters swarmed the American formation, the sky filled with tracers. The sound of machine gun fire was constant, a tearing, ripping sound that merged with the roar of engines and the shouts over the radio. "Watch out for that Zero! Fighters on your tail! Get him off me!" The voices grew more desperate. Then, one by one, they stopped. The first Devastator went down around 09:25, then another, and another. The Zeros attacked from above and behind, diving through the formation, pouring fire into the defenseless bombers. The TBDs couldn't evade without ruining their torpedo runs. They had to fly straight, had to hold their course toward the carriers. Gay watched Waldron's aircraft ahead of him, saw his skipper grab the top of the windscreen, pull himself up out of his seat, throw one leg over the side as if to escape. The aircraft was already burning, already dying. Dobbs was still in his position, still firing, apparently unaware that Waldron was trying to abandon ship. Then Waldron's wingtip hit the water. The Devastator cartwheeled, disintegrating in a spray of metal and water and flame. The ocean swallowed it immediately. Gay and the surviving aircraft flew over the spot where their commander had been. There was no time to mourn, no time to think, only time to keep flying toward the carriers. Gay's own rear gunner, Radioman 3rd Class Bob Huntington, was firing continuously at the Zeros, swarming around them. Gay could hear the 30-caliber gun behind him, could hear Huntington's breathing over the intercom, could hear him calling out fighters. Then the breathing stopped. The gun stopped. When Gay glanced back, he saw Huntington slumped in his position, killed by Japanese machine gun fire. Gay was alone in the aircraft now, wounded himself, blood running down his left arm from where a bullet had grazed him. His controls were shot up. Half his instruments were dead. But the carriers were right there, less than 1,000 yards away. He could see the red rising sun painted on Kaga's flight deck, could see the Zeros landing, having run out of ammunition, shooting down his squadron mates. He dropped his torpedo at 800 yards, felt the aircraft lurch upward as the 2,000-pound weapon fell away, watched the torpedo hit the water, watched it run straight and true toward Kaga, watched the carrier turn, presenting its narrow bow, the torpedo running harmlessly past. Then 5 Zeros jumped him. Gay stood no chance. Machine gun and cannon fire shredded his aircraft. The Devastator shuddered, parts flying off, engine smoking. The controls went dead in his hands. For a moment, he considered crashing into the nearest carrier. Just pushing the nose down and diving into Kaga's flight deck, taking as many Japanese sailors with him as he could, it would be easy. He was close enough, fast enough. But survival instinct overruled revenge. Gay aimed for the water instead, trying to belly in, trying to live. The Devastator hit the ocean at over 100 miles per hour. The canopy slammed shut from the impact. Water poured in. The aircraft sank immediately, pulling Gay down with it. He panicked. Couldn't get the canopy open. Couldn't breathe. "That's when I got scared," he would say later. The one moment in the entire battle where he admitted to fear was when he was trapped in a sinking aircraft, drowning. He got the canopy open somehow, pulled himself out, surfaced, gasping, wounded, alone in the middle of the Japanese carrier fleet. Every single other aircraft of VT-8 from Hornet was gone. 15 Devastators launched, 15 shot down, 29 men dead, 1 survivor. The attack had lasted less than 15 minutes. Gay floated in the water, watching. A small, deflated life raft bobbed to the surface nearby, still in its bag. A black rubber seat cushion floated past him. He grabbed both, but didn't inflate the raft. He'd heard the stories of Japanese pilots machine gunning downed American aviators in life rafts. He wasn't going to give them an easy target. Instead, he inflated just his Mae West life jacket, held the deflated raft underneath him, and pulled the seat cushion over his head. Just his face showing, eyes barely above water, the black cushion providing camouflage against the dark Pacific. A Zero came back, circling low over the water where the American aircraft had gone down. The pilot spotted Gay, made a strafing run. Machine gun bullets stitched the water in a line toward the lone survivor. Gay ducked under the cushion, held his breath, felt the impacts in the water around him. The Zero pulled up and flew away, apparently satisfied that the American was dead. Gay surfaced again, gasping. Still alive, still alone. And then, from his position floating in the middle of the Japanese fleet, he watched the rest of the Battle of Midway unfold. At 09:30, Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise arrived. 14 more Devastators, led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay. They'd lost contact with their fighter escort just like VT-8. They attacked alone, just like VT-8. Gay watched them come in, watched the Zeros, rearmed and refueled now, tear into them. Watched Devastator after Devastator splash into the ocean. Lindsay's aircraft went down. Then another. And another. 10 of 14 aircraft lost. 4 survivors made it back to Enterprise, so shot up they were barely flyable. At 09:50, Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown attacked. 12 TBDs under Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey, with 6 Wildcat fighters as escort. The Wildcats tried. They fought viciously, employing the Thach Weave defensive tactic that their commander, Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thach, had developed specifically to counter the more maneuverable Zero. They shot down several Japanese fighters. They drew off some of the defenders. It wasn't enough. The Zeros were too many, too experienced, too good. 10 of 12 TBDs were shot down. Massey died in his aircraft. Only 2 torpedo bombers returned to Yorktown. Of 41 American Devastators that attacked the Japanese carriers at Midway, only 6 survived. 35 aircraft destroyed. 68 men killed. And not a single torpedo hit. Not one. From the Japanese perspective, the battle was going perfectly. 3 separate American torpedo attacks, all repelled with minimal effort, no damage to any carrier. The Americans had thrown their best punch, and it had accomplished nothing except to get a lot of brave men killed. The Japanese carriers began recovering their fighters. The Zeros that had massacred VT-8 and VT-6 and VT-3 landed on their carriers to rearm and refuel. The Combat Air Patrol, which had been pulled down to wave-top level to deal with the torpedo bombers, started climbing back to altitude. The flight decks were cluttered with aircraft. Fuel lines snaked across the decks. Ordnance crews rushed to rearm planes for a counterstrike against the American carriers. Below decks, in the hangars, more aircraft waited, fueled and armed. And that's when the dive bombers arrived. From his position in the water, Gay heard them first. The high-pitched scream of SBD, dauntless dive bombers pushing over into their attacks. He looked up and saw them. Dozens of aircraft, tiny specks against the sky, suddenly growing larger as they plummeted toward the carriers at terminal velocity. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey had led Enterprise's dive bombers on the same wild goose chase that Ring had led Hornet's air group. But McCluskey, unlike Ring, had made the right decision when he found empty ocean. He'd kept searching, spotted a lone Japanese destroyer heading northeast, gambled that it was heading back to the main fleet, followed it. His gamble paid off. At 09:55, 3 minutes, before his bombers would have had to turn back due to fuel, he found the Japanese carriers. At almost the same moment, dive bombers from Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, arrived from a different direction. 47 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, all arriving simultaneously, all unopposed because every Zero in the sky was at sea level, having just finished destroying the torpedo bombers. The sacrifice of VT-8, VT-6, and VT-3 had pulled the Japanese fighters out of position, had cleared the sky above the carriers, had created a window, brief and bloody, for the dive bombers to attack unmolested. McCluskey's voice crackled over the radio. "Earl Gallagher, you take the carrier on the left. Best, you take the one on the right." The Dauntlesses pushed over, 70-degree dives, 450 miles per hour. Pilots aiming their entire aircraft at spots on the Japanese flight decks, using their planes as gun sites. From the water, Gay watched bombs fall, watched them hit, watched enormous fireballs erupt from Kaga's flight deck, then Akagi, then Soryu. One after another, the carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor were transformed into blazing wrecks. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The explosions were massive. Fueled aircraft on the flight decks detonated. Ordnance in the hangars cooked off. Secondary explosions ripped through the carriers, blowing huge sections of flight deck into the air. Fires raged uncontrollably. Gay felt the concussions through the water, felt them pound against his stomach. He was less than 2 miles from Kaga, close enough that he worried the pressure waves might rupture his internal organs. Japanese destroyers rushed toward the burning carriers, trying to rescue survivors, trying to fight fires, but the damage was catastrophic. All 3 carriers were doomed, though it would take hours for them to sink. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, had been separated from the others. It escaped the initial dive bomber attack. At 10:40, its aircraft would find and damage Yorktown. But in the afternoon, American dive bombers would find Hiryu and destroy it too. 4 Japanese carriers, all sunk or fatally damaged within the span of 6 hours. The greatest naval defeat Japan had ever suffered. And Gay floated in the middle of it all, still hiding under his seat cushion, still holding his deflated life raft, still alive somehow despite everything. Japanese ships passed within yards of him. He could see sailors on the decks, could have recognized individual faces. He held the cushion over his head and prayed they wouldn't spot him. As the sun set, the last Japanese ships steamed away, heading northwest, fleeing the disaster. Gay was left alone, truly alone now, floating in thousands of square miles of empty Pacific Ocean, wounded, exhausted, surrounded by the debris of the greatest carrier battle ever fought. He waited until full dark before he dared inflate his life raft. Climbed in, lay back, looked up at the stars. He'd been in the water for more than 12 hours. He would be there for another 18 before rescue came. The next morning, June 5th, A PBY Catalina patrol plane spotted him. The pilot, recognizing the bright yellow life raft, circled low. A bubble window opened, and a sailor's head popped out. "Seen any Jap planes lately?" the sailor asked. "No," Gay replied. "Good, let's get the hell out of here." They hauled him aboard, flew him to Midway. From there he was transferred to Pearl Harbor, where Admiral Nimitz himself came to debrief him. The Admiral wanted to know everything Gay had seen, everything that had happened to VT-8, everything about the destruction of the Japanese carriers. Gay told him. Confirmed that Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were gone. Described watching them burn, watching them die. Nimitz listened carefully. When Gay finished, the Admiral thanked him, told him he was a hero, gave him the Navy Cross. Gay didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a survivor. The sole survivor of 30 men who had flown into certain death because their commander ordered them to, because duty demanded it, because someone had to attack those carriers even if it meant dying in the attempt. 29 men of VT-8 from Hornet died at Midway. Their names: Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, Lieutenant Raymond Moore, Lieutenant James Owens, Lieutenant Junior Grade George Campbell, Lieutenant Junior Grade Jeff Woodson, Ensign Ulvert Moore, Ensign William Creamer, Ensign Harold Ellison, Ensign William Evans, Ensign Grant Teets, Ensign Henry Kenyon, Ensign John Gray, Chief Radioman Horace Dobbs, Radioman 2nd Class Otway Creasy, Radioman 3rd Class Bob Huntington, Radioman 3rd Class Hollis Martin, Radioman 3rd Class Ross Bibb Jr., Radioman 3rd Class Darwin Clark, Radioman 3rd Class Ronald Fisher, Radioman 3rd Class Horace Dobbs, Radioman 3rd Class Francis Polston, Radioman 3rd Class Max Corkins, Aviation Machinist's Mate 2nd Class Robert Miles, Aviation Ordnanceman 3rd Class Emilio Maffei, Seaman 1st Class Glenn Holden, Seaman 1st Class Tom Petrie. 6 more men from the VT-8 detachment at Midway died that morning. Lieutenant Langdon Feebling led those 6 new TBF Avengers, the aircraft that were supposed to save lives, the modern replacements for the obsolete Devastators. They attacked the Japanese fleet at 0710, even before Waldron's Devastators from Hornet had launched. 5 of the 6 Avengers were shot down. Feebling died. His crews died. Only Ensign Albert Burt Ernest survived, along with his radioman Harry Ferrier. Their gunner, Jay Manning, was killed by zero fire during the attack. Ernest brought the shot-up Avenger back to Midway on one wheel, with over 70 holes in the aircraft, bleeding from shrapnel wounds to his face. 30 men from Torpedo Squadron 8 flew into combat on June 4, 1942. 29 died. George Gay lived. The question that haunts military historians isn't whether VT-8's sacrifice was necessary. The question is whether it accomplished anything. The official answer, enshrined in textbooks and documentaries, is yes. Unequivocally yes. The torpedo squadrons, VT-8 most of all, pulled the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level. They forced the Zeros to expend fuel and ammunition, massacring the TBDs. They created the window that allowed McCluskey's and Leslie's dive bombers to attack unmolested from high altitude. Without the torpedo attacks, the dive bombers would have faced fully alert Japanese defenses. More SBDs would have been shot down. Fewer bombs would have hit. The battle might have gone differently. This is the heroic narrative, the narrative of meaningful sacrifice. The narrative that says those 29 men didn't die in vain, that their deaths purchased victory, that war sometimes demands such terrible arithmetic. And it's true, as far as it goes. But there's another truth, darker and more uncomfortable. The torpedo attacks at Midway failed because of systemic problems that everyone in authority knew about but nobody had fixed. The TBD Devastator was obsolete. Everyone knew it. The Navy had ordered its replacement in 1940. The TBF Avenger was in production. But bureaucratic delays, manufacturing bottlenecks, and training requirements meant the new aircraft arrived too late for most squadrons. The Mark XIII torpedo was fatally flawed. Everyone knew it. It had been unreliable since its introduction in 1938. Only 1/3 of test drops worked properly. In combat, the failure rate was even worse. But the Bureau of Ordnance refused to admit the problem, refused to halt production, refused to fix it, until after Midway forced their hand. The tactical doctrine was suicidal. Everyone knew it. Torpedo bombers attacking without fighter escort against alerted defenses weren't just vulnerable. They were dead. The Navy's own pre-war exercises had demonstrated this. But the coordination problems that plagued American carrier operations in early 1942, the inability to launch aircraft quickly enough to maintain formation cohesion, the inadequate radio communication between different squadrons, all of these issues were known and unsolved. Waldron knew all this. He'd argued about it. He'd written memos about it. He'd trained his men as best he could to survive the impossible. And in the end, none of it mattered because the system sent them into combat with obsolete aircraft, broken weapons, and suicidal tactics. They went anyway. That's the part that breaks your heart. They knew the odds. Waldron had told them straight. One plane might survive to make the final run. Maybe. If they were lucky. They climbed into their Devastators anyway, followed their commander anyway, pressed home their attacks anyway, not because they were stupid or brainwashed or didn't value their lives, but because someone had to attack those carriers. Someone had to try. And if not them, then who? This is the paradox at the heart of military service. The system that sent them to die was flawed, bureaucratic, sclerotic, had failed them in every meaningful way. But the mission still mattered. Japan still had to be stopped. The carriers still had to be sunk. And so they flew. There's a temptation to romanticize this, to call it noble, to say they died for freedom, for their country, for each other. And all of that is true. But the deeper truth is simpler and sadder. They died because they were there, because it was their job, because they'd been trained to do something, and when the moment came, they did it, even knowing it would kill them. That's not romantic. That's just terrible. Terrible in the old sense of the word, inspiring awe and fear, making you confront the reality of what we ask young men to do when we send them to war. George Gay lived to be 77 years old. He flew combat missions at Guadalcanal, became a flight instructor. After the war, spent 30 years as a commercial pilot for TWA, got married, had a family, lived a full life, but he never stopped being the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, never stopped carrying the weight of being the one who lived when 29 others died. He wrote a book about it. Sole survivor. Gave lectures, appeared at air shows, served as a consultant on the movie Midway in 1976. He always insisted he wasn't a hero. The real heroes, he said, were the men who died. He was just lucky. Lucky that his aircraft was shot down where it was. Lucky that the Japanese pilot missed him. Lucky that the PBY found him. Lucky, lucky, lucky. He was right, of course. Survival in combat often comes down to luck. A few feet to the left or right, a second's difference in timing. Randomness masquerading as fate. But there's another way to look at it. Gay survived to bear witness, to tell the story, to make sure that what VT-8 did, what all the torpedo squadrons did at Midway, wouldn't be forgotten. When he died in October 1994, his ashes were scattered over the Pacific, over the same waters where his squadron mates fell, where he spent 30 hours floating, where he watched 3 Japanese carriers burn. The Navy learned from Midway. Eventually, the TBD Devastator was immediately withdrawn from frontline service. The Mark XIII torpedo was completely redesigned. By late 1944, it could be dropped from 800 feet at 300 knots, making torpedo attacks survivable for the first time in the war. Tactical coordination improved. The Navy developed the Fighter Direction Officer position, a specialist who controlled fighter cover from the carrier, ensuring escorts stayed with strike groups. Radio communication improved. Launch procedures were streamlined, and the industrial might of America began producing aircraft and pilots in numbers that made losses sustainable. When a squadron was decimated, it was rebuilt. new pilots, new aircraft, back into combat. The Japanese couldn't do that. Every experienced pilot they lost was irreplaceable. Every carrier sunk was gone forever. That's ultimately what Midway was about. Not just tactics or luck or heroism, though it involved all of those. It was about industrial capacity and demographic depth. Japan had a finite number of carriers and pilots. America could build more, would build more, did build more. By 1943, Essex-class fleet carriers were joining the fleet at a rate of 1 per month. By 1944, the U.S. Navy had more carriers than the rest of the world combined. Pilots were trained in vast numbers, not individually crafted over years like Japanese aces, but mass-produced through systematic training programs. The torpedo squadrons that flew in 1944 weren't better than VT-8. But they had better aircraft, better weapons, better tactics, better support, and there were more of them. So many more that losing a squadron no longer crippled the fleet's offensive capacity. That's the victory that VT-8's sacrifice helped purchase, not just the sinking of 4 carriers at Midway, but the breathing room that allowed America to bring its full industrial power to bear, to build the fleet that would eventually overwhelm Japan, to win the war. Was it worth 29 lives? That's a question historians can debate. The men themselves never got to answer. They made their choice on the morning of June 4th, when they followed Waldron away from the safety of the formation, when they held their course toward the carriers, despite the Zeros swarming around them, when they stayed in their aircraft and died doing their jobs. We can honor them without pretending their deaths were painless or easy, or anything other than what they were. Young men, most barely old enough to vote, killed far from home in a war that had barely started. On April 5, 1943, President Franklin Roosevelt awarded Torpedo Squadron 8 the Presidential Unit Citation. The citation reads in part, "The loss of 29 lives, typifying valor, loyalty, and determination, was the price paid for Torpedo Squadron 8's vital contribution to the eventual success of our forces in this epic battle of the air." 29 lives. The price paid. In 1944, the Navy commissioned USS Waldron, a Fletcher-class destroyer named for Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. His daughter Nancy sponsored the ship at its launch in Kearney, New Jersey. The destroyer served with distinction in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, before being decommissioned in 1973. Naval Auxiliary Air Station Waldron Field in Corpus Christi, Texas, was also named in his honor. It trained thousands of naval aviators through the rest of the war and beyond. At the Naval Academy in Annapolis, Waldron's name is inscribed in Memorial Hall, along with other Academy graduates who died in combat. Midshipmen walk past it every day. Most don't know the story. Don't know about the morning he broke formation, about the 15 Devastators, about the sole survivor floating in the water. That's why stories like this matter. Not to glorify war or romanticize sacrifice, but to remember that history is made by individuals making choices, sometimes impossible choices, sometimes choices where every option is terrible and you pick the one that seems least terrible and hope you were right. Waldron didn't know his disobedience would lead his squadron to glory. He just knew the Japanese carriers were northwest, not southwest, and every instinct he'd developed over 15 years as a naval aviator told him to turn that direction. So he did. His pilots didn't know following him would change the course of the war. They just knew their commander had made a decision, and they trusted him. So, they followed. Gay didn't know he would be the sole survivor. He didn't know he'd spend 30 hours in the water. He didn't know he'd have to live the rest of his life carrying the weight of being the one who came back. He just tried to do his job, drop his torpedo, survive if he could. None of them were superhuman. None of them were without fear. The recordings and interviews that survive make that clear. They were scared. They knew the odds. They did it anyway because it was their job and someone had to do it. That's the lesson of Torpedo Squadron 8 at Midway. Not that heroism is easy or glorious or rewarded, but that sometimes ordinary people, regular kids from South Dakota and Texas and Kansas, find themselves in situations where they have to make extraordinary choices. And when that moment comes, when the choice is between turning back to safety or pressing forward into almost certain death, when the choice is between following orders that are probably wrong or trusting your instincts and accepting responsibility for that choice, when the choice is between living with cowardice or dying with honor, some people, not all, but some, choose the hard thing, not because they're heroes in some mythological sense, but because they're professionals, because they care about their shipmates, because they believe in something larger than themselves, because in that moment, looking at the alternatives, this is the choice they can live with, even if living with it means dying with it. 15 aircraft, 30 men, 29 dead, 1 survivor, 4 Japanese carriers sunk. The course of the Pacific War changed forever. The arithmetic of sacrifice. The terrible mathematics of war. Was it worth it? Ask the people of Japan, subjected to 3 more years of war and ultimately 2 atomic bombs. Ask the Allied prisoners of war who might have died in captivity if Japan hadn't been defeated. Ask the millions across Asia under Japanese occupation. Ask all the people who lived because America won and Japan lost. Or ask the mothers who lost sons, the wives who lost husbands, the children who grew up without fathers. Ask them if it was worth it. There's no answer that satisfies everyone. There's no answer that makes it okay. War doesn't work that way. Sacrifice doesn't work that way. All we can do is remember. Remember that real people died. Remember their names. Remember that they chose to do something that killed most of them. Remember that their choice mattered. On June 4th, every year, a handful of people remember. Veterans, historians, the families of the men who died. They gather, sometimes, at memorials or reunions. They read the names. They tell the stories. Lieutenant Commander John Charles Waldron, the cowboy from South Dakota who trusted his instincts over orders and was right. Ensign George Henry Gay, Jr., the kid from Texas who survived to tell the story. And the 28 others whose names deserve to be spoken aloud. Chief Radioman Horace Franklin Dobbs, Lieutenant Raymond Alvin Moore, Lieutenant James Clarence Owens, Jr., Ensign Ulvert Moore, Lieutenant Junior Grade George Manton Campbell, Lieutenant Junior Grade John Charlton Waldron, Ensign William Wirt Evans, Ensign Harold John Ellison, Ensign William Robert Creamer, Ensign Grant Ulysses Teets, Ensign Henry Robbins Kenyon, Jr., Ensign John Parker Gray, Radioman 2nd Class Otway Delbert Creasy, Jr., Radioman 3rd Class Hollis Martin, Radioman 3rd Class Ross Bibb, Jr., Radioman 3rd Class Darwin Lester Clark, Radioman 3rd Class Ronald Joe Fisher, Radioman 3rd Class Francis Sidney Polston, Radioman 3rd Class Aswell Lovelace Pico, Radioman 3rd Class Max Allen Calkins, Aviation Pilot 1st Class Robert Benson Miles, Aviation Machinist's Mate 2nd Class Emilio Maffei, Seaman 1st Class Tom Humbert Petrie, Seaman 1st Class Glenn Lester Holden, and Radioman 3rd Class Robert Carl Huntington, who died in Gay's aircraft, still firing at the Zeros until the moment of protection. Bullet found him. Say their names. Remember what they did. Understand the choice they made. They climbed into obsolete aircraft with broken weapons and suicidal tactics because the mission mattered and someone had to try. They followed their commander into certain death because that's what the job required. They died doing what they were trained to do, what they swore to do, what their sense of duty demanded they do. That's not comfortable. That's not inspiring in a simple way. That's just true. And maybe that's enough. Maybe remembering the truth, uncomfortable as it is the only real honor we can give them. Not monuments or medals or movies, just the truth. 15 aircraft. 30 men, 29 dead, 1 survivor, 4 carriers sunk. The morning of June 4th, 1942, the Battle of Midway, Torpedo Squadron 8. They went in knowing they probably wouldn't come back. They went in anyway. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.